Good afternoon, and I think all of you know me, so I won't tell my name. But Rosanna insists I should tell. It's a customary for the University of Western Australia to acknowledge that our university is situated on Noongar land, that Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of the land and continue to practice their beliefs, languages, and knowledge. I'm pleased to see a number of familiar faces in the audience, and I won't be able to acknowledge everyone, but I like to acknowledge the Stewart family. They're sitting in the front two rows, and special guest, the Institute's Advisory Board Chair, Dr. Terry Enright, somewhere, and the Director of Western Australian Agricultural Research Collaboration, that's Dr. Kelly Pierce. I'm sure that it's worth meeting Kelly. A lot of you know Kelly, but in her new role. Emeritus Professor David Lindsay, Neil Turner, Doug, and many others, and guest colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the University of Western Australia and the Institute of Agriculture, I wish to welcome you to 2023 Hector and Andrew Stewart Memorial Lecture. So this year marks the 29th lecture, with the inaugural event held in 1966. Some of you were not born at that time. The lecture is in honor of late Honorable Hector J Stewart, MLC, and his son, the late Mr Andrew Stewart, both from Wagin. They were wool growers. In 1921, Hector Stewart was elected to represent the southern provinces as a country party member of the Legislative Council. The following year, Hector, together with several of his colleagues, refused to accept an increase to his parliamentary salary. Nowadays, they won't, they argue for more salary. In 1923, that money was given to the University of Western Australia and was used in part to establish these memorial lectures. His son, Andrew Stewart, was the president of UWA's Guild of Undergraduates and twice dean of UWA's then Faculty of Agriculture. As published in Countryman, which is a rural newspaper, in 1959, his students saw him as a friend, advisor, as well as a limitless source of knowledge on broad agriculture and various aspects of agriculture. The Stewart family has continued his devotion to agriculture education through their strong support of the memorial leadership. And the family, few years ago, donated another sum of money, so that is gone into the bequest fund. That allows us almost done. Every year we could conduct this lecture. So if you have any suggestions for next year's lecture, whether from within Australia or internationally, send a private email to me so we can accommodate. I think the better we get good suggestions, we'll go through a committee within the Institute and then select that. As you can see, over the decades, our lectures have explored many topics, from sheep fertility to the war against weeds, and from soil health to global poverty. Last year was the first time in this lecture series delivered by a farmer, the inaugural chairman of the Birchup Cropping Group, Ian McClelland. Now let us have a brief look at John's biodata. Dr. John Dixon is going to deliver the lecture. He is the adjunct professor currently at the University of Queensland. John has worked for around 5 decades with farming system research and development for sustainable intensification and diversification in all agriculture continents, primarily with the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, short form CIMET, and Australian Centre for International Agriculture Research, ACIAR. His current positions are Adjunct Professor of Farming System at the University of Queensland, Visiting Fellow for Sustainable Development Policy at the Australian National University, and is based in Canberra, and guest professor of farming system at Gansu Agricultural University in China, which I have also quite a lot of collaboration there. He's a board member of Sustainable Intensification Innovation Lab located at Kansas State University and funded by the US Agency for International Development, led by our friend Vara Prasad. And board member of Global Evergreening Australia in Melbourne. He's also a fellow and chair of the ACT division of the Academy of Technological Science and Engineering. John has received a number of prizes, including the MS Swaminathan Award for Leadership in Agriculture, which he really cherished that. And he was a close friend of late Professor Swaminathan. John graduated from University of New England in Armidale with a PhD in agricultural economics and in smallholder soil erosion decision making, a master's in natural resources and master's in economics and Bachelor of Rural Science, again from Uni Armidale. He has published widely, including textbooks, serves on editorial board of several journals. Tonight, John will explore the topic, incorporating sustainability and resilience into agri-food development, fracture points and tipping points. John, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Sadiqa. That's a wonderful introduction, and good evening to everybody in the audience who could come along. I'm looking forward very much to the opportunity for some interactions. I'm also very appreciative to meet the Stewart family, and it's a great honour to have this opportunity to add yet another lecture to the series of lectures on such an important topic for all of us, that is agriculture and food. And it's the connections between our resources and our production, crops, livestock, and the rest of agriculture defined broadly, that sustains us as Homo sapiens and mankind on this planet Earth. Allow me now to step forward, as long as I can manage this technology, to slide number 1. It will be my contention in this evening session that we have failed our jobs in terms of incorporating sustainability and resilience into our agricultural development and food development systems globally. And I'll draw quite heavily for this on low and middle income countries, and that's where I've spent 40 plus years of my career, so that's what I'm quite familiar with. I hope that this will also resonate with farmers from West Australia, and that in a way Australia has been very much connected to much of the international development activities. It was an Australian who led to the creation of the Food and Agriculture Organisation that was established in 1944, before the end of World War II. That was an Australian. Australians have been very present throughout the consultative group of international ag research, the CGIAR, and as much of this audience knows, and it's quite fitting because there's so much we have to offer from Australia that is useful to our near neighbours and to the rest of the world more widely. The outline, I'd like to kind of pick up the theme from Bebbington, the chief scientist of the UK about 2009 or so, who spoke of the perfect storm, and then look at the progress and the problems in relation to those challenges that face a lot of the agricultures in much of the low and middle income world. I'll move to sustainable intensification and connect that with resilience. Move on to farming systems, defined broadly, then the institutional context, which maybe lies at the heart of a lot of my concerns about what has gone well and what has not gone so well. Then some strategies and a few words or points of conclusion. If we look to our climate history and look to the evidence from ice, we've got geologists and we've got people who dig holes in ice. And if we look at the ice cores that run us back through 450,000 years or so, we can see there's been wild fluctuations in temperatures, in CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere. And that has led up to the present period, which is almost what some people call a Goldilocks period. We've had a series of great turbulence in climate leading up to about 15,000 years ago. And at that moment, the climate warmed and stabilised, and that is what led us, having been hunter-gatherers for 300,000 years, maybe 1 million of us, don't kid yourself, that was Australia's population, it was 1 million, maybe 10 million, at the point at which hunter-gatherers progressively became, in part, settled agriculturalists in the Near East, in Levant. So that was just a tiny period. We've had 12,000 years since then, compared with 300,000 years as hunter-gatherers, emerging out of Africa and then spreading all over the world as a very competitive, effective and extractive species. There was a co-evolution of development, of course, through that entire period as hunter-gatherers, what we would call ecosystems today, of institutions, of technologies, imagine fire, and or even many of the other technologies that were used by hunter-gatherers, human and nutritional health and the risk outcomes. So that's the backdrop in which we've developed our food systems, and we've made remarkable progress. Imagine that was 1 million or 10 million, we don't know exactly, people who started agriculture in a settled format. We're now feeding 8 billion people. That's extraordinary if you think about it, and the technologies and the systems that we've used to develop that. For me, it's doubly remarkable because when I started my international work, the population of the world was 4 billion. It's doubled in my career. Not my fault. But imagine how much more food we now consume and that we've produced. But there's major problems this century, and some people call it the perfect storm. And that's the confluence of less land, less water, climate change, doubling, trebling of populations, changing diets. And on the right of the screen, there's a set of what I use since since about 2000 actually, with the World Bank, as a series of mega trends and drivers that actually determine the directions that farming systems evolve in any particular setting. Climate and natural resources starts the list, then there's population density, hunger, poverty, then human knowledge, skills, inclusiveness, which and energies available, whether it's fire or whether it's fossil fuels or renewables. And that leads us to the technology driver. And technology drivers, which were informal for 96% of our evolution, were fully informal. And in the last 1% or so of the last few hundred years, we've provided formal government or government private sector support. Prior to that, it was all informal, adaptive, individual innovation. And markets trade have shaped, since the hunter-gatherer days, markets and trades have shaped what mankind did. And the ways in which groups have always organised themselves into institutions and devised leaders and set up policies is the other seventh area of drivers. There's a whole lot of pressures that emerged from the perfect storm. Lagging progress towards SDGs, the population soaring in some parts of the world and contracting in other parts of the world. That's a new experience for mankind. Soaring in India, especially in Africa, and contracting most probably in China, as it is in Italy and some parts of Europe. Undernourishment is a concern for all of us. There's probably the umbrella concern of all is what we could call converging rural or regional insecurities. There's a whole lot of resource questions, population questions, institutional questions in regional and rural areas that need a lot of attention, whether it's in Australia or the US or Africa and Asia. And of course, loss of land, I'll come back to that presently, and fresh water and climate change and the loss of food diversity. We've very much concentrated our diet into a few species, wheat, maize, rice, driving 50% or so of our plant-based calories. And we've got, laying over this, trade and decreasing, and this is the greatest concern at the moment, decreasing public and private investment in agricultural education and innovation. And that should be of deep concern to all of us. Regardless of the current storm, we have to recognise the world has developed impressively in the last couple of 100 years. It's quite remarkable in terms of poverty, in terms of reduction, which is the first top square up there, in terms of education, in terms of literacy, vaccination, child mortality. It's pretty impressive when you look over 200 years, what's been achieved. There's also some concerns, of course, but we can pass by them. The biggest thinking amongst, or concern amongst many at the moment, is the very slow progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which were the international goals set up, and Australia as a signatory from 2015 to 2030. And that followed the Millennium Development Goals, which grew out of all the discussions around the Rio Conference in the 1990s and the subsequent food summits. So of 36 SDG targets that have been recently reviewed by Monash and colleagues, only 2 are on track out of 36 to reach their 2030 targets. It wouldn't pass, would it? And 14 are showing fair progress, 12 limited or no progress, including poverty, and 8 are deteriorating, including fishing, sustainable fishing, and food security. So that's a great concern. And only 13 of 74 countries have integrated the SDGs into their budget lines. Actually, the agriculture and the agri-food systems do underpin nations' economic development, social development, as well as just the food that is on our tables. I use agriculture in the broad sense that FAO uses it to cover crops, livestock, forestry and fisheries, and I also think about local institutions, local arrangements, local markets, community arrangements, etc., as part of the local system that's relevant. Agriculture has always depended on natural resources, and ag uses 40% of terrestrial resources, 70% of the fresh water, that is a fracture point. 17% of emissions come from agriculture, but we also offer great promise in terms of nature-based solutions to sequester carbon on the other side. This summarises the way in which Sustainable Development Goal 2 is linked up through agri-food systems to most of the other Sustainable Development Goals. At the bottom of it is, without making progress and achieving agri-food systems that are working and delivering, we will not successfully achieve most of the other SDGs. And so it has been through the course of history. There's obviously some worrying trends around turbulent and warming climate. Climate, particularly temperature and precipitation, and food production are coupled. They cannot be separated, as we know in West Australia, but it's also true across Asia and Africa. And we're approaching 5 what are called tipping points in climate, which could lead to runaway climate change. And those are things like the Arctic glaciers or the Amazon forests or the Gulf streams or the streams in the Atlantic Ocean that moderate the Western European climate and make it livable. So there's a variety of points that could that we're approaching right at the moment, 5 of those tipping points. There's really contrasting land use trends, very different in Africa and Asia. Africa has been expanding into new lands to a significant degree for the last 30, 40, 50 years, whereas Asia has very much focused on intensification. There's been less land available to expand onto, and that has also been or benefited from much greater use of water resources, particularly aquifers or underground water. We don't know whether Asian intensification can continue sustainably, and we don't know about the limits to African development, because about half of African countries are running out of land to expand onto, either because for a variety of reasons, not least climate change. I was part of a recent CSIRO analysis that saw the ways in which what we call the agro-pastoral zones of Africa, which is the mixed crop and livestock areas, like we have so much of West Australia, and those areas will reduce in Africa between 25 and 40% by 2050. So massive reduction in areas of lands. And what happens to that farming and those populations, we simply don't yet have answers for. There's of course increasing land degradation, we're familiar. It's particularly acute in the case of cultivated land, but absolutely true of grazing land across large extents of the world, that those lands and pastures are overgrazed. And it's a massive drag on crop and livestock productivity. Declining freshwater availability is probably a massive fracture point, because at the moment we use 70% in agriculture, but populations are growing, populations are urbanising, and industry is developing, and they all need water. So we will probably need to reduce and make more efficient the use of water in agriculture. And water and food are very much coupled. There's an old rule of thumb: 1 calorie of food uses a litre of water. And it can be green water from the rainfall, or it can be irrigated blue water out of a channel or a dam. Most of the world's irrigated food basins are already over-allocated. And that's true whether you're in the Colorado and Texas, or whether you're in northwest India or northern China. huge concern for plant breeders is that we're seeing and recognising a slowing in yield growth. And these graphs from Ken Kasman just show that wheat and rice and maize, and we're talking about a growth that for many, many years was 40 or 50 or 60 kilograms per hectare per year. Pretty much a straight line for a long time. But if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that in some of the really highly productive food bowls, look at rice in California, which is the top with the line with the yellow dots, and it reached a plateau. But if you look look carefully at wheat in Northern Europe, including the UK, from World War II, it was a straight line in increase in yield, and then it hit the elbow, and it's plateaued. Likewise, rice in China. So these are harbingers of food insecurity. When we know that we have to we have to add 50% or 60% to food production by the year 2050 just to feed the growing population. Ironically, food prices, real food prices, have been dropping over quite a long period of time since 1900, whilst the population is increasing. However, recently food prices have gone up. The trouble with falling food prices is not only farm incomes fall, but also there's a general complacency, and governments and other investors do not invest in agricultural research. So what's needed if we look ahead to 2050? Well, IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, says that in Washington says that we need to increase global food production by 60% by 2050 compared to the 2010 baseline. And a 40% increase in cereals, roots, tubers, 66% increase in meat production, 78% in LME countries. We'll probably see an increase in food prices. That's good for exporters of food. But we'll probably see a 9% increase on average per capita food consumption, perhaps around 3,000 calories per person per day. But almost surely we'll have at least 500 million who are at risk of hunger, even in 2050. And we've presently got about 850 million, grosso modo. So the big challenge, as the way I look at it, is that if you look back here from 1970 on the left to 2010, we saw that there was a 129% increase in food production. We did massively well in increasing food production, while population was growing at 1.76%. Therefore, some people say to get to 2050 will be a piece of cake, because that's only another 70% increase from that 2010 mark. Yet, we're losing land, land is degrading, temperatures are rising with climate change, precipitation is shifting, the amount of fresh water available for irrigation will reduce. So we've got a whole range of challenges that mean that arguably the next achievement of that 70% up to 2050 may be more difficult and will require more science, more effective institutions, more collaboration across disciplines and agencies, and probably governments and regions than in the past in order to achieve our 2050 goal. Where will that food be needed? Well, on the right-hand side you can see that South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, you remember Africa is going to double its population up to 2 or 2.5 billion, and East Asia. So although China will contract, other Asian countries are growing in population. So there's still growth, and that's where the food will be required. So those are great for us as West Australian food exporters, those areas. Bear in mind that some of those consuming areas are now exporting, such as India or South Asia, let us say, is exporting grain now to us when they were simply importing years ago. There is some lessons from historical intensification such as the Green Revolution, that was what I call phased low-risk intensification. It was essentially rice-wheat intensification in irrigated areas, the easy areas. They were preceded by good development of irrigation channels, roads in India that preceded the availability of the good genetics that came from for rice and for wheat. And it moved after the irrigated areas onto other high potential areas, and only much later to the low potential areas, and later to livestock, aquaculture and horticulture. It also benefited from very well-funded research and development. There was 100 years of research in India before the Green Revolution came to India. So there's a huge amount of knowledge that really underpinned the miracle of the genetics, the seed that came in. So it wasn't, one shouldn't underestimate the fact that it was very fertile institutional ground and knowledge in India that enabled the genetics to take off and create the Green Revolution in India. And that's also related reasons to why it's not succeeded so well in Africa. Hardly at all. So, but we now have second generation problems of natural resources that need attention post-Green Revolution, soils, water, etc. The other thing that was particularly strong in China and in India in terms of agricultural development was the complementary welfare and other development programs, infrastructure, education, health, employment creation, and some welfare or subsidy and income programs, which were massively important particularly in the more remote parts of India or China. So that enabled the so-called Green Revolution to be so successful. I'm looking at how we go forward sustainably and resiliently, and I'll be arguing around systems and interaction, and I'll be saying we have to broaden our thinking from farms, from crops to crops and livestock, and from crops and livestock also to perennials, to shrubs, to trees, to thinking about other uses of land too, and how that all comes together in a synergistic way. And institutional partnerships, collaboration and leadership are critical. Now, the sustainable intensification of agriculture is a terminology that's grown up in the last 15 years, more or less. It's essentially about, in a very simple way, doing better with the same, or doing better with less. And aspirationally, people talk sometimes. Aspirationally doesn't mean it's realistic, but they talk about why can't we double production on half the land. And for example, Professor Ratan Lal would say, who's a very distinguished professor of soil science, he would say, why on earth can't we go from 1.5 million hectares of land worldwide for crops to 1 billion? And we have the technology. So what holds us back? Well, it's the transfer mechanisms, it's the institutions, it's the knowledge, the know-how, but not the technology per se. So that's one side to it all. There has been an explosion of literature around sustainable intensification, and I'm going to also make the point that sustainable intensification is very different from agricultural intensification, and I'll show you why in just a moment. There's a whole plethora of terms that that are used in agricultural development and this is, I'm addressing myself to the students in particular, whether we're talking about climate smart food systems, sustainable land management, multifunctional agriculture, agroecology, sustainable ag, landscapes approaches, integrated natural resource management, it just goes on and on. Most of them boil down to good basic science and practice on the ground. And there's all these terminologies and the nuances between the approaches, but I would argue that on the ground there's not too much difference between all of those and sustainable intensification. So let's not trip over the terminology. Or resilience is now being recognised by the global community. For example, the World Economic Forum at Davos in 2023 listed out the risks, and there are so many that relate to agriculture and to food and, of course, to climate mitigation and adaptation failing. But also think about farms, the markets are also risks too, and supply chains, as we saw in the last couple of years. So we have a whole area, a set of themes, and risks are probably arguably increasing empirically. Therefore, we have to put more attention onto incorporating elements related to risk or the word resilience into our sustainable intensification processes. Farm risks, just to give you a little insight, on the left you can see maize in Africa. See the very high bars which showing the coefficient of variation, or the, let's say, the variability in yields and prices for maize, and compare that with rice in Asia, and you can see that rice in Asia is actually much less variable, but still a major concern for farmers. Let's look a little bit at something I like to characterise sustainability in terms of being either strong or weak. And a lot of the literature, most of the literature, taking off from Godfrey and my colleagues like Jules Pretty, start off with what I now call weak sustainability. And let us look at the table at the bottom, and the current or business as usual situation is where we've got declining soil water status in aggregate across the world, which is that there. And that's the farmlands that produce the food that we all eat. And we have stagnating or slowly increasing farm system productivity. That's where we are now, with the big challenge to try to get to 2050 with increased productivity. Most of the literature focuses on what I call weak SI, weak sustainable intensification, which says let's maintain the resource base as we have it now. It's already grossly depleted in so many areas. There's whether you look at Nepal or whether you look at Rwanda or Latin America, there's large areas of abandoned land that's simply, or the Middle East, that's simply abandoned because it's degraded. So keep maintaining stability of that land is not much of a goal or an objective. And I would argue that we must always go to strong SI, which is improving the soil water status, which underpins sustainability at the same time as increasing yields. They have to go hand in hand. And of course, we know if we improve the soils and improve either the soil moisture holding capacity or the availability of water for irrigation, if we do that, we'll anyway push up productivity. So it's a win-win solution to reorient away from weak sustainability to strong sustainability. We always need to think that degradation, of course, is not limited just to farmland. We have to think across the wider landscapes and in fact some people are indeed applying themselves to city and urban areas, green areas, as well as the interface, the peri-urban areas, and also the natural ecosystems. So all of those merit attention. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan in 1968, as the Green Revolution was getting moving, said, "I pleaded for converting the Green Revolution into an evergreen revolution." And thinking there that we have to mainstream the principles of ecology. We have to have multiple crops year round, not just one or two crops, etc. And Garrity picked this up, Dennis Garrity, in Evergreening Agriculture. And so that really is, is the wider landscape that goes along with crop and livestock lands. Evergreening the Ag, there is an international program which has massive targets in terms of land and carbon restoration. And there is right now a pledge for carbon removals through nature-based solutions being advanced by Indonesia and Kenya, that will be launched by their heads of state in Dubai at COP28, which will be to parallel the methane pledge, will be a carbon dioxide reduction or removal pledge. And that's moving from just reducing emissions to actually let's look at how we can use farmland and how we can use livestock, how we can use, let's say, the wider ecosystems to absorb carbon. We know that as we do that, productivity will go up anyway, so it's a win-win-win. The populations, as mentioned already, that will be with us, massively increased populations in Africa and in the Asia-Pacific region. We know that climate change the temperatures will lead to reductions in crop yields, for which our breeders are working very hard at the moment to build heat tolerance into many of our major crops. Agriculture, as mentioned, is both a source of emissions as well as a solution in terms of sequestering of carbon, and that's the triple win-win-win. There are complicated modelling around decarbonisation pathways. The good news for agriculture is that if managed in the proper way, these will actually lead to increased productivity and increased stability of production. The best analyses being done on the top solutions to climate change show in most of them that agriculture and food systems are really amongst the top solutions to our climate problems. So we should be asking for and seeing more investment back into agriculture and food from climate finance. The 4 out of the top 10 in the case of the Project Drawdown, or 8 out of the top 20 are related directly to food and to agriculture. There's a hugely shifting in science and technology patterns. If you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll think about agricultural research for development, which is roughly half public and half private on a global level, that the top 5 spenders in 1960 were USA, Germany, Brazil, UK and China. Look at the bottom, the top 5 spenders in 2013, China, USA, India. So the landscape has shifted in terms of the movers and the shakers on agricultural and food research. We have to look at the future sources of intensification and diversification, but I'd like to make an argument here that most public and investment policy and investment questions are actually spatially related. One cannot compare Margaret River with Shark Bay, Don, as you were saying before. You know, we have to think about the different farming systems or farming, including livestock systems, and we have to categorise them and classify them in some easy way for policy makers. And the same is true for investment. And so I was involved in a process for the World Bank 20 years ago that looked at how to differentiate farming systems for the World Bank investments into low and middle income countries, and to look at the different farming systems, and we ended up with 75 of them, of which 15 are the critical food bowls of the world. And those are just farming system zones. And you might think of them as agricultural zones or land use zones. And those are how they map out across the world. And that's been used for a lot of prioritisation of research, for investment, planning, and education. And it, of course, can cascade down from global down to regions such as you can see there, Africa and South Asia, or down to countries. And one can, if one thinks about two of those factors, which is access to agricultural services, research, extension, education, inputs, fertiliser, pesticides, etc., on one side. And if you think about the quality of the land and the resources on the other axis, those two axes together can be used in order to locate most farming systems around the world, which gives us an indication of their trajectory for development, but also their research needs and also their investment opportunities. One thing we sometimes have to, I always remind people, is that we've usually got livestock involved somewhere in agricultural systems alongside crops, and off-farm income is a critical source of cash for many smallholders. It's good to consider the value chains as well as part of our thinking and analysis about local system development, but it's also a fracture point because they often don't work as we want them to. The complexity of household decision making is another area that's really often overlooked. And this is just a little graph or diagram that shows that from a Delphi analysis that smallholders in many, many parts have strategies linked either to intensification of existing crops and livestock, or diversification, or to increasing farm size, or to getting more off-farm income, or to leaving agriculture. And that's a pretty instructive set of options that they blend, and if we can relate our technology and our research to those, it's always helpful. The institutional reality is quite messy in any development context, from ag research at the top left down to agribusiness at the bottom right, through markets, policies. There is no magic bullet that works everywhere, except that sometimes we can say there's a set of sort of best practices that we sometimes talk around public-private partnerships that have been codified and documented. But on the left, you'll notice that farmers and markets should be at the centre of whatever partnerships are being devised. It's not something to be created by scientists on their own. And there should be continuous learning through any partnership that progresses. Important point as we share from Australia to other regions or between regions is spillovers and institutional mechanisms that enable, and this was part of the success of, or the rollover of the Green Revolution into South America or Latin America. And there was something like 350 new rice varieties released, and it was unleashing the power of targeting to specific systems to prioritisation, not trying to do everything at once, to partner coordination. So the investors and extension and research and policy were talking to one another that enabled this really high rate of return on this spillover work in Latin America. Some of the strategies that are needed, it's said so often that there's a lot of discussion about sustainable intensification, but not much about what the real research agenda needed is, or the priorities. And above all else, there's, in blue, little research on putting all the components together. And that, for me, is the failing of a lot of our sustainable intensification work. We've got lots of magic bullets, great research, good technologies, but they don't often come together well enough on the farm. There are trajectories that are quite concerning, and I can see at the moment we have a declining trajectory in terms of sustainability and resilience for the world in blue. It's business as usual. Asia is doing better than, as you see on the right, Africa, which is going downhill. So these need to be considered and turned around. The complexity of farming and food systems we've talked about, and of course farming research has moved to a very substantial degree beyond on-farm research on a plot towards working with restoration of assets and thinking about soils, and then to genetic intensification and ecological and socio-economic intensification. When all of those are being put together, we then have actually farming systems research in the current modern version that is being more effective. We know there's a whole variety of good farm practices that go to sustainable intensification, but their integration is crucial. And the ways in which to marshal the efforts of markets and extension, of policy and capacity building, universities and other training together will be part of any scaling that's effective of sustainable intensification. And I've always seen great benefits from conservation agriculture-based sustainable intensification, as here in West Australia, so too in Africa or Latin America, and growing in South Asia and East Asia. There are 6 principles that I have thought goes towards summarising a lot of what I've mentioned here, and it's focused here in terms of implementation, because so often it's not the design of our projects that go amiss, it's the implementation of the projects that disappoints. And so if one has this checklist, are we integrated? Are our systems integrated? Have we thought about that? Is there continuous innovation, not just one-off at the start, but continuous through the process of the project? Is there a focus on impacts, not just on outputs? Is there sharing of information across all partners? Is there continuous investment from all levels, and institutions enabling the implementation? So that can be protected in various planning methods that we teach in our master classes on sustainable intensification, and that can also be monitored and assessed through a system that's developed at Kansas through the Sustainable Intensification Innovation Lab, which looks at the 5 domains of farming and food systems. So all of what I've been talking about sounds complicated, but it can be monitored fairly practically and fairly easily, and is being monitored in USAID projects. There's a set of key insights that we've covered, Perhaps the only one I've not spoken much to is the fact that actually sustainable intensification applies to all farm sizes. So it's not something for smallholders, it's not something just for big commercial farmers, it's actually for all of those, but of course in different ways. And my conclusions would be 3 points. Number one, that in fact hundreds of millions of smallholders and many commercial farmers do face this perfect storm: turbulent climate, degrading resources, weak institutions, especially where sustainability and resilience are missing or weak. Number one. Number two, agri-food system development must shift onto these trajectories of sustainable and resilient intensification. And it's got to be supported by those integrative systems approaches and by consultative participatory methods across agencies, across communities, across government departments and industry or private sector. And we've got to look for the fracture points. Maybe it's going to be value chains, or maybe it's going to be adoption decisions. And we've got to reinforce the positive tipping points where there's an incentive for farmers to take on board, to run with the technologies. And the devolution of planning and monitoring to local community levels enables adaptive management and avoids many impediments to implementation. So I always sort of go back to Charles Darwin. He said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives, but the one most responsive to change. And that's where we are now. We're in a perfect storm. And Toynbee, Arnold Toynbee, who's a great historian, who said the well-being of civilizations can be judged by the ability to respond to human and environmental challenges. So those are my two closing remarks. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, John. Excellent. I tell here at the university, because change is happening all the time, and don't just sleep. Continue to change, otherwise you won't have a job. That's how the universities operate all over. Well done, excellent talk. We'll take some questions, so be clear, brief, tell your name, where you are from, and then short answers, please, so we can cover more people. So who wants to go first? Richard Bell.
You mentioned the CG systems. There was recently an article that said the CG system needs a revolution, and argued that the first 3 decades they had lots of ones on board, the last 2 decades there's not much to show for that investment. My question is, doesn't matter, have the national agriculture IOA systems grown and strengthened capacity to the point that the CG centre needs to contract back to just a few poor areas and a few wicked properties and let the national systems shine?
No way, the CG is still needed. It's definitely needed, but it's perhaps not needed in the old way. There's categories of countries that still have weak NARs, they still have weak research systems, and so they would still pick up CG varieties, for example, and almost release them as they are because they don't have capacity to back cross and adapt. In the other stronger NARs, the job of the CG has changed completely to becoming the glue that links those countries together to increase their research productivity above where they are now. And therefore, it's a case of spillovers and managing and fostering and facilitating spillovers by the CG. So they're needed, and some reform, of course, will help that. Well, the SDGs are, of course, aspirational, and the mere existence of the SDGs has probably fostered a significant additional amount of resources, and both not just financial but also human resources. So that sort of additionality may well have been positive, number one. Number two, of course, complex systems are complex. They evolve, what does that mean? That means that we have to have systems of adaptive management that keeps on understanding the big picture, doesn't lose sight of the big picture. If we lose sight of the big picture in an evolving system, we're in trouble. So we have to keep it in view, but move ahead with good monitoring, good feedback, and that means we have to have devolution, so you can't have the central government or whatever it is, or the UN or something, dictating or directing. It's got to be devolved to the lowest possible level, and then it can evolve in the fastest, reasonably practical way. Never forget, when you talk innovation, farmers themselves are one of the major innovators in the whole system.
Thank you. Kelly?
I wouldn't stop the good work that's going on in genetic intensification or any of the other intensifications is absolutely needed. But I would double, treble or more, quadruple the effort that goes into the glue or the collaboration across all of those areas, because our institutional and policy environments and investment patterns have led us to invest in the silos, and what's underinvested right now is the glue across, the cross linkages and the collaborative linkages. That's where I'd go.
Very good. Again?
I wouldn't worry too much, because the number one and critical piece about a PhD is the rigour of the analysis of the particular problem. And if you can learn the analytical skills within the agricultural science setting in order to analyse, even if it's, you might fear to yourself it's a micro problem. Don't worry, if you've got the rigour in that, you can then apply it when you post-PhD, when you move into research or development or policy or whatever. If you apply that, those skills of rigour rather than the specific details of the science, you will be fine.
Yeah. So, well, he's my student, so I'll sort it out. Okay, Roger?
Absolutely correct. Part of our thinking in that farming system spatial work was, in fact, crops and livestock methods of animal husbandry will change across those systems as the systems themselves evolve with temperature, rainfall, increase, decrease, or intensity, but on one side, or markets on the other. So you've just got to look at the US maize production and how that's moved, or look at the way in which maize is moving into what we thought were cool temperate areas 20 years ago. And the same in Australia, we can see the movement. So it will, I think it will continue, agriculture will continue to be dynamic. Some of that's predictable, and some of it is less predictable, particularly the market-related stuff, I would say. So I would say let's not ever think that we're just stuck, or even that the current situation is the status quo and will remain so. I would conversely assume that it's going to change. The technologies, of course, the varieties that come through the pipeline, as well as soil management, nutrient, pests and so on, they also determine the location of where particular crops have a competitive advantage over other crops or varieties.
We'll take the last question from Terry and Wright.
Thanks, John.
The points where we hit the elbows were particularly the case if you looked at the ones we were showing in that diagram anyway from Ken Cashman. California, in other words, that reached, there was no gap between achievable yield and farm yields at the moment. Whereas if in Africa and a lot of Asia,
Big
there's big gaps. Huh? We're talking about 75% gaps across a lot of Africa for maize, huh? For example. Whereas in California, you're talking of rice or they're up around that 80% mark of achievable yields. Same with wheat in the UK. So I think that number one, we ran out of, we hit some limits, some biological limits, number one. Number two, the climate has also had an effect on this, for sure, and prices. So what we're looking at there is not the breeder's progress, which is running at about a bit under 1% actually, still. We're looking at what's happened out in the farm, and what happens on the farm depends also on the price of inputs, on the subsidies, and the et cetera, et cetera. So it's a concern because we're not increasing aggregate food production for trade, but I don't think it necessarily means that the rest of the world will hit that same elbow for quite a long time.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yep. If you could sit down. Yeah. So please join me in thanking for John giving an excellent talk. But I won't summarize, but John covered a number of points. He started with the perfect storm, then looked at the global scenario and how we moved from very hungry place to food rich in many countries. Take, for example, in the 1947-50, in India produced only 50 million tons of grain. The record they produced last couple of years, 382 million tons of grain. That's coming from about 110 million hectares. So their intensification is already there. Take for China, for example, very similar, 1954, the Cultural Revolution, about 50 million tons, and currently they produce 625 million tons from approximately same land. In fact, China got less productive land than India. Take, for example, Australia with nothing, and we have reached up to, the best time we got was about 45 to 65 million tons. Of course, we are limited by dry land system. We also intensified from wheat being 60% on the landscape. Now overall wheat is only less than 40% on the so-called 21 million hectares in the country. So intensification is happening, but we could do more. And again, excellent talk, and I'm pleased that this talk is already recorded. Rosanna, our brilliant communication officer, she's going to put that by Friday on YouTube, because we had something like 50 people from overseas showed interest. They all want to come and I have to pay for the airfare. I said no, but we will record that, and so the slides will be available and so on. So this is come to a close, and this year has been fantastic for UWA Institute of Agriculture. We had many industry forums, postgraduate showcases, open field day at the farm, Pingelly Farm. About 150 people attended, special lectures and so on. We're also a bit tired now, but I think this has been a fantastic, because of the good response from audience like you and from those who are not here. Now, I would like to invite the members of the family and few guests to join outside here for a photograph, and then followed by some drinks and things for the family. So I would like to thank everyone for attending and supporting the Institute activities over the past 1 year, and we have some exciting programs currently being developed for next year. Thank you.